In this video, we will be making a 4-layer Pochoir print. So this is paper stencil printing. The subject matter I've selected is Sting, a professional wrestler from WCW. This image was from 1997 when he first emerged as this sort of crow-like character. So I tried to use Photoshop and I created a posterized version of this image for inspiration. Ultimately, I chose to redraw the image instead of tracing the posterization. I blocked in the darker values for the black or key layer. I figured out where the mid value ranges would be. And I used color to kind of color in where I thought those mid values could be, or for the background for the blue and green here. Next, I'm creating graphite transfer paper. So I'm taking very soft graphite and fully filling up a sheet of paper that's the same size as my printing paper and my stencils. So everything will be 8.5 by 11 for this image and process. That'll make everything a lot easier for the actual registration and printing. If you're using acetate or something transparent, you don't really have to do this step. This is just mostly useful if you're kind of using some sort of paper for your stencil, which I found this sort of waxy paper. I don't even know what it was originally used for, but I decided to use it for the stencil, which kind of had its pros and cons. I think it'll hold up longer, but ultimately it made the transfer process more difficult. So here I am kind of blocking in shapes for this black key layer. I'm kind of picking and choosing. Even though I did this painting, I'm not sticking to it too strictly. I'm kind of taking some liberties. Which, as I work through it, you'll see that the transfer process didn't work quite like I hoped. That sort of waxy paper that I selected actually did not receive the graphite material very well. If you use Bristol or something like that, this process will work much better. So I found it was kind of smudging and rubbing away as I worked. So sometimes I would have to retransfer the graphite. So of course be very careful when using an X-Acto blade. Try to keep the blade away from your fingertip. Here I am switching to a sharp new blade. I'm not around a sharp container, so I'm wrapping the old blade up in tape. I'll put it in a sharp container later. And now I've got the new blade in and it cuts much, much better. So I highly recommend changing your blade on a regular basis. This is very thick paper and it required the use of 4 blades over the entire process. If you use a thinner material, you won't need to change blades this often. So here's the first stencil, the black layer. And then, as you make your way through this process, this is the red layer, you can kind of line up the stencils to make sure that they're going to register well. If you're having difficulty with the graphite transferring successfully, perhaps you need more pressure. So here I'm using the back of the pencil and applying a little extra pressure just to transfer the image through. These are the final cuts of my red layer. So moving along to the green layer, I'm picking and choosing shapes. You don't really need to use the tracing paper. I just figure, if I want to reproduce this image in a different medium, or if I need to remake a stencil, or just because I don't want to draw directly onto my preliminary painting, the tracing paper is helpful for all those things. So once again, I'm checking my stencils to make sure they match up, and I am moving on to the blue layer. So this is another part of the background, but I'm also integrating some shapes into the figure. So some of these shapes that I'm doing are kind of overlapping, but I think this is just going to allow me to play around with different sorts of printing options as I move through possibilities with this stencil. And at this point in time, my blade is getting fairly dull. Try to avoid what I'm doing here, like twisting my wrist around and pulling in a lot of different directions. It would actually be a lot better if you rotated the workpiece and pulled in a consistent direction. This is a lot safer, and you really want to keep the blade away from your hands and pulling away from your body or kind of off to the side. So safety is really important, especially if you're working on this late at night. And once all the stencils are done, go back and just clean it up a little bit. I'm finding all sorts of little pieces of paper that I'm kind of trimming and cutting out of there with the X-Acto knife. So for the printing process itself, it really helps to have this consistent 8.5 by 11 size that we're working with, and I'm just using blue tape to kind of create a hinge. So this is going to allow me to print and then lift up the stencil as I go to check my work. So I'm using a makeup sponge. This is pretty affordable. If you don't have access to a more specialized Pochoir brush, then I really recommend using these makeup sponges, which these ones came from Daiso. I think it was just a couple bucks for a whole bag full of them. So I'm just taking this cyan paint and I'm working it into the openings of the stencil. You really want to take your time with this process. Don't rush it. If you're globbing the paint into there, it's going to squeeze underneath the stencil and ruin your image, make it look very sloppy. So the name of the game is to work very slowly and take your time with it. You really probably want to do 2 layers, but you can also get some pretty artistic effects, just in terms of how you apply it. I'm going for a more fully saturated look for this image, so I'm adding a little extra paint and ultimately going over everything twice with this cyan. I think some areas could have just been went over one time, but I decided to go a little extra on it. So for layer 2, we are going to go with green paint. So once again, using this blue tape hinge, and I'm taking out a little bit of yellow paint and mixing it with some of the cyan I already have out. So it's kind of a bluish green, somewhere in between green, blue-green. And I'm putting on gloves, just to get a little bit of the paint, keep it off my fingers. And I'm using these makeup sponges, pushing the paint through the openings of the stencil yet again. And so here we have the completion of the green layer. So this is a cool background. We're going to have some red in the figure and it will kind of pop from the cool background. That was kind of the color decision I was making with this piece, thinking about sort of a warm versus cool relationship, using these fully saturated colors, which, to me almost have kind of a juvenile or childlike sensibility to them. I feel like this image could be used as, maybe an editorial image or like advertising for a toy or something like that, depending on what the context might be. So I think this stencil, I would love to print it with some different kinds of colors. Maybe a more reduced palette might be good for this sort of sting imagery. But for now, we're going with fully saturated color choices and seeing how those work together. And so now we are getting into the final layer, the black layer, using ivory black. And I'm kind of using the nose as a point to fixate on because I want the nostrils and the mouth and the eyes to all align between the 3 layers. I think that's really important to the cohesion of this image. And I'm finding this black paint is fairly transparent. Uh, I ultimately had to do kind of like 3 passes going over everything to get it to be a nice, rich, velvety black. But if I wasn't going for full saturation, I think the shades created just by going over maybe one time is actually quite nice here. But I think I really want to do a nice solid black through this stencil, so I'm going to go over it a few extra times in the process. So here we are coming up on the end of our print. So of course you could make multiples of an image. That's kind of the point of printmaking. Um, I would of course encourage you to try different kinds of color combinations and arrangements to see how they impact the voice of your work or the color harmony. And as I go through, I'm just taking care and just taking my time and making sure everything is well printed and craftsmanship is good. So of course that's very important to create convincing work, is just make sure your craftsmanship is on point. Yeah, definitely can't wait to try this out with other kinds of color arrangements. Hope you have fun doing this yourself.